We'll put a stop to that once and for all. Officer, those people are taking away our train. I want you to chase them away.
But they're only picking up a couple of nickels and dimes. They can't hurt your train.
I'm a taxpayer, and I demand my right.
11 years old, Sidney Kibrick turned down a weekly salary of $750. In today's currency, that is $13,000. But in the midst of the Great Depression, why would a youngster desert a fortune? What actually transpired on the Little Rascals set holds the key to the solution. Though a co-star who was so violent that studio officials kept a casualty list of his victims, 16-hour workdays, and 2 hours of education, Sidney was aware of the horrifying reality, but America saw Alfalfa as the innocent victim. He is now exposing the grim reality as the only survivor. That ruined a whole generation of young celebrities. On July 2, 1928, Sidney Kibrick was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota. At the time, America was booming. There was jazz everywhere. Movies were just beginning to talk and the stock market was soaring. However, that ideal photo was short-lived. Everything fell apart in October 1929, a little more than a year later. The Kibrick family was now surrounded by even more suffering as the Great Depression struck hard. Sidney's parents were unable to wait for things to improve. They packed up their belongings and relocated to Los Angeles since they were barely making ends meet. Sidney was a newborn. Leonard, his older brother, was just 4 years old. The journey included about 1,800 miles, and it wasn't a leisurely drive. It was a matter of survival. Jobs and opportunities were promised in California, particularly in the expanding film industry. The Kibricks believed their boys may have a chance when major studios like MGM and Hal Roach sought out child actors. No one anticipated the gamble would pay off so quickly. Sidney and Leonard went to Grumman's Chinese Theater one day with Sidney's mother. A man approached them after the film. "I could use that little kid in the movies," he added, pointing to Sidney. Everything changed in that instant. It turned out the man was a scout for talent. Sidney, then 5 years old, was suddenly headed for stardom as a youngster. It was no ordinary role. Sidney was chosen for the renowned Our Gang television series. His weekly income was $750. That may seem like a good salary now, but it was enormous during the worst financial crisis in American history. That is more than $11,000 a week in today's currency. The typical adult's weekly income was around $16. Sidney was the primary provider for the family when she was just 5 years old. His older brother Leonard had already cleared the path. He had joined our group in 1934 and was 4 years older. Leonard typically portrayed rough youngsters, bullies, and the people you love to despise. In 1936, he played his final part in the series. Sidney replaced Butch as Butch's sidekick in 1937 when Tommy Bond, another actor, assumed the primary bully role. He was referred to as the Woium. A real-life brother and sister acting as villains together in the same program is something that is uncommon in Hollywood. However, behind the scenes, the situation wasn't as joyful as it appeared on film. It was dubbed the Dream Factory. However, it seemed more like a never-ending machine to young actors like Sidney Kibrick in the 1930s. The same 2 hours of required instruction kicked off each morning. 2 hours was all that was required. After class concluded, the real work started. It lasted 6 hours on some days. For some, it continued for 16 minutes. There were no pauses or genuine worries for the children's level of exhaustion or overwhelm. The filmmaker's only objective was to complete the day's shooting at all costs. One of the primary directors, Gordon Douglas, didn't give a damn about how tired the children were. They continued shooting if the scenario wasn't finished. There were no strict restrictions protecting kid actors back then. It would not be until 1939 that the Coogan Act, which was intended to ensure equitable treatment and protect earnings, was passed. Sidney had already established a reputation at that point. However, he had to endure some of the most severe circumstances a child could encounter in order to get there. The fact that he was only a child didn't matter to the studio. The product was important to them. Sidney was a part of that product, just like a lot of other people. His initial duties were little. He was one of 3 children gathered in the backdrop next to a river wharf in the 1937 film Dead End. He also made an uncredited appearance in The Bowery in 1933 in The Children's Last Struggle. These background elements weren't merely filler, though. They were lessons on survival. The children on the scene had a clear chain of command. The most popular ones were those with speaking lines, particularly those that included character names. The others only made an effort to remain noticeable enough to draw attention. It was cruel. Friendships were scarce. There was always competition. Sidney went up that chain slowly. He was more than simply the background youngster by 1935. He started wearing the Our Gang shorts on a daily basis. Better salary, greater screen time, and a little more respect were all part of that. In the same year, he made appearances in episodes such as Little Papa, Beginner's Luck, and Anniversary Trouble. The amount of work grew. However, the prize also did. Sidney had a stable work when the rest of the world was still in the throes of the Great Depression. His two kids provided income for his family, who had moved from Minneapolis to Los Angeles in pursuit of opportunities. Sidney's older brother, Leonard Kibrick, was also a member of our group. In the 1930s, the majority of Americans focused on surviving. The average family made around $1,368 annually. A lot of fathers were unemployed. Whole communities went without food. Therefore, a child actor's meager salary was sufficient to transform a family's situation. In contrast to most other industries, the entertainment sector remained stable throughout the crisis. Even if only for an hour, people wanted to get away from their troubles. Sidney and other children participated in that escape. They may nonetheless attract audiences, even if they were paid less than adult actors. Despite being a little child with red hair and freckles, Sidney Kibrick went up to become one of the most well-known villains in early Hollywood comedies. Hal Roach substituted Tommy Bond, a commanding and powerful figure on screen, for Leonard Kibrick in 1937 when he required a new bully for the Our Gang shorts. Bond wasn't by himself, though. Sidney, who became Leonard's sidekick and was actually his younger brother. Butch and Wajum were completely different from one another. Bond had a loud voice and was almost 4 feet 10 inches tall. Sidney was short, wiry, and just 4 feet 5 inches tall. He talked with a harsh little bark. They looked like trouble on film. Butch would yell, "Come on, Wajum," and Sidney would rush in with her arms fluttering like a miniature bodyguard. However, their relationship was the complete opposite behind the camera. Bond was like a big brother to Sidney. He gave him acting lessons, gave him pocket money, and even shared snacks. Together, they visited 37 theater openings in 4 states during the summer of 1938. To save money, they remained in the same hotel room. The act was adored by audiences. Party Fever, to put it briefly, became the year's highest-grossing comedy in more than 200 venues. It was dubbed revived bully interest by the studio. Sidney wasn't the most likely candidate for the position. Among Roach's child performers, he was placed 31st in weight and 26th in height. However, that's precisely why they chose him. The producers thought that Spanky and Alfalfa needed a tough, unthreatening foe. Someone who gave the gang a sense of accomplishment. Particularly during the Depression era, his red hair and freckles matched what others perceived as a traditional playground taunt. In real life, he and Carl Alfalfa Switzer also had a bad relationship. Just in 1938, there were 5 conflicts between them, according to studio notes. In the scripts, Roach made use of that tension. In theaters, patrons were even urged to jeer at William. Boo the YM was written on cardboard cutouts that were displayed in several lobbies. Boo. It was among the earliest instances of a studio using actual hatred for marketing, a tactic that wrestling would later imitate for decades. However, it's difficult to be intentionally loathed, especially as a child. Sidney claimed that although being the antagonist followed him around, the set seemed organized and secure. Directors adored him by the time he was 10 years old. He hardly ever needed to retake anything. However, there was a cost. Between 1937 and 1940, 14 outside opportunities were offered to him. 12 of them were simply rough kids or bullies. Sidney received more jeering during live appearances than the Wolfman, according to a joke made by former co-star Jackie Cooper. While on travels, kids tossed popcorn at him and shouted obscenities, so ushers had to take him to the restroom. The strange thing was that Sidney acted nicely on set and was courteous and on time. He never used foul language, according to the call papers. He was stuck as the bad one, though. Identity dissonance is the word psychologists currently use to describe that. It's the tension that arises when your public persona and your true self diverge. Sidney claimed to have discovered how to divide himself. Whim was really a party trick. Sid was the actual youngster. It saved him. When the acting finished, he moved into real estate, continued his education, and kept away from the typical child star crashes. Nevertheless, the moniker persisted. "We don't hire bullies," the manager remarked when Sidney, then 23 years old, asked for a position as a bank teller. He lost his job because of the prank. He still had 312 fan letters in 1977, almost 40 years after glove taps. Moreover, half of them inquired as to whether he had just beaten someone up. Fans waited in line for pictures at a 1986 reunion of our gang and pleaded with him to slug them. At times, he cooperated by giving the camera a fist, but he was worried within. He seemed to be locking himself more deeply into the old persona each time he leaned into the joke. In actuality, Sidney wasn't the bully. Carl Switzer was the one. Alfalfa appeared to be the unfortunate victim on film. It was the opposite off-screen. Switzer was always criticizing background actors. The majority of them had no protection on set and only earned $3 each day. As a joke, he would offer to share his lunch and then eat the dessert in front of them. According to one group, though, they had to take out a portion of her hair because he had smeared adhesive in it just before a performance. Another day, during filming, he soaked a bunch of extras with a hose, destroying their costumes. Cleaning each garment cost $12, which is about half of their weekly salary. A record of Switzer casualties was also maintained by Roach's staff, who assured parents that their children would not be stationed next to him. It was cruelly ironic. Wohum would tamper with Alfalfa's boxing gloves on camera. In reality, however, Switzer added spicy pepper to Sidney's sandwiches merely to make them laugh. Sidney referred to it as the opposite day. He was scared to defend himself. He would be held accountable, and the scenario would be wrecked if he did. Additionally, studio press materials portrayed Wohum as the issue while praising Switzer as an example of spontaneity. On one occasion, right before a video, Switzer splattered Sidney's brand new white sneakers with India ink. Replacing them cost $4.50, which is almost a full day's wages. The public, however, was unaware. The writing was all they could see. Maintaining order on the set was a difficult task for director Gordon Douglas. Every day, he had around 30 children running around. He employed color-coded cue cards, stopwatches, and even a bell that rung every 30 seconds to remind everyone to be quiet in order to keep everyone on track. Following Board of Education's 1936 Oscar victory, Roach condensed each short film into a single reel. This meant that filmmakers had less than 10 minutes to convey a whole story. Delays were not an option, but Switzer still wreaked havoc. Douglas wrote S delay in his notes. During a 4-day football Romeo shoot, it appeared 14 times. Douglas even experimented with military lineups. Before each take, the children had to recite their moves. They received penalty points if they made a mistake. They were sent home with 5 points. It did work sometimes. Nevertheless, anarchy prevailed sometimes. Hal Roach stunned Hollywood on May 31, 1938, when he sold MGM his entire Our Gang franchise for a pittance. This covered all of the props, the storyline, and even the contracts for the kid players. This amounts to almost $558,000. Roach was having financial difficulties, which is why it occurred. Short comedies had lost their appeal to audiences. They desired complete double characteristics. And Roach's botched deal with Mussolini's son had made the industry look bad. MGM seized the chance when it presented itself. The children found themselves in a different environment very immediately. They now received their salaries from MGM. They transferred their dressing rooms to the other side of town. They sold their faces and names like furniture. Roach had allowed Spanky McFarlane's contract to expire, so the 7-year-old even had to re-sign it. So others like Alfalfa Switzer were taken aback to learn that their film personas were now legally owned by MGM and that their status as stars was no longer guaranteed. The situation swiftly altered. GM had regulations. Studio school was rigorous. Time cards were taken seriously. Roach's set had resembled a clubhouse in the backyard. MGM had the feel of a factory. The kids were profoundly affected. It was similar to being abruptly transferred from one school to another. Although the shift is rarely discussed, the children never forgot it. Then the moniker change appeared. There was a catch when Roach repurchased the original negatives in 1949. The term "our gang" was off limits to him. He was compelled by MGM to remove their emblem and any indication of the original titles. Thus, his group devised a solution. The show was dubbed the Little Rascals. The name was taken from vintage trade publications. By 1954, the same movies had returned and were shown in American households under a new label. However, there was a price for the change. The replays brought in nothing for the child actors. Our Gang was still controlled by MGM. Only the film prints belonged to Roach. No money meant no royalties. Even worse, in order to accommodate new time slots, editors started deleting entire scenes or stay out of the spotlight. Following criticism from organizations like the Winprint ATP, certain changes were made. Bits of 4 minutes were eliminated. Nobody observing realized anything was absent. An illegal technicality had permanently altered the series. George Sidney, 22, was hired by MGM to helm the new episodes once they took over. He had a lot of ideas and was ambitious. He had just videotaped Judy Garland's screen tests. Sidney swiftly took control after pressuring MGM to purchase Our Gang. However, his creation was very different from Roach's. Roach had allowed children to improvise. They might quarrel, giggle, or mispronounce words. The cameras continued to record. Sidney contributed large dance sequences, music, storyboards, and several takes. The raw, funny charm was gone, yet it still felt polished. Aladdin's Lantern, one of the episodes, appeared more like a Broadway production than a children's short. Sidney's version included tutors, meal break schedules, and elaborate lighting arrangements. Children's playtime was reduced. The series lost its allure at that point, according to fans. Sidney would go on to direct Kiss Me Kate and Showboat, among other musicals. However, the children... Now they were minuscule parts of a large studio apparatus. The shift was too much for a few of them. Since he was 5 years old, Sidney Kibrick had been an actor. He'd had enough by 11. He approached his mother after filming time out for lessons in 1939 and stated, "I'm done, Mom. Acting is no longer what I want to do." She was taken aback. He was paid $750 a week. Most doctors don't make that much. It covered their rent, groceries, and even his older brother's driving lessons. Sidney, however, refused to move. "Finally," he repeated, and in costume he left the set. No discussion, no retakes. Everyone was shaken by that one instant. Kids were supposed to be submissive by the studios, but the line was drawn by Sidney. The family had survived the Great Depression thanks to his money. His weekly salary was around $13,000 in today's currency. The family lost 90% of their income when he resigned. Even though he was an electrician, his father only made $20 a week. They had taken out a loan on Sidney's future wages, which his mother attempted to renegotiate. In order to cover his rent, his father pawned a watch. They were forced to relocate to a less expensive apartment close to Mount Vernon Jr. Elevated. Sidney, however, didn't give up easily. He had considered it. Sidney saw it coming, but the majority of young performers crashed and burned. He was worn out. Call times at 4 a.m. angered him. 4 a.m. angered him. Baseball was something he missed. He detested constantly being portrayed as the bully's sidekick, William. At 12, he was afraid of turning into a cranky old boy. He was only 11 years old. Clarity like that is not common. According to experts, youngsters typically don't make those choices until they are 15. Sidney was ahead of the curve by years. Later on, he claimed to have been fortunate enough to spot the edge before I did. Child labor studies continue to quote the line. Sidney prospered because he didn't simply leave the sector. After completing his education, he earned a degree in business and started working as a real estate developer. Sidney found a new life as other child stars struggled with drugs, jail time, or bankruptcy, but he did not immediately disappear. He continued to act for a few more years due to contracts. He starred in Fightin' Fools in 1941 and Bubbling Troubles in 1940. Subsequently, he played minor parts in 2 war movies, including 1943's Kid Dynamite. Then he slipped away in silence. In order to join a new comedy combo, he declined a 7-year option. When he departed the set for the last time, he even forgot his cosmetics kit. He was not present at the premiere. Instead, he heard it on the radio. He didn't want to be pulled back in by the applause. He talked about what it was actually like years later. He claimed that after 2 hours of education, children had to spend 6, 8, or even 16 hours a day filming. They continued to work until the directors were happy. There were no contemporary safeguards. He didn't get any sleep. He fell asleep while watching scenes. It seemed like you were in an oven because of how hot the stage lights were. Childhood sleep deprivation raises anxiety and health risks later in life, according to studies. In his 20s, Sidney claimed to have suffered from sleeplessness. The person everyone recognized as Alfalfa from the classic Our Gang shorts, Carl Switzer, had grown up. However, he never became famous or wealthy. He was still enraged over a $50 prize he felt he was due when he arrived intoxicated at a modest Mission Hills residence on the evening of January 21, 1959. He had used that money to express gratitude to a stranger for returning a hunting dog that had gone missing. However, he did not own the dog. Moses Stilts was the owner of it. Carl demanded his money back. He refused to let it go. The dispute quickly became physical. Switzer used a clock to smash Stilts over the head. He reached for a gun. When that didn't work, he produced a knife. Stilts was already 38. He shot once. Carl felt the bullet tearing into his groin. On the route to the hospital, he bled to death. He was just 31. According to a jury, it was self-defense. However, it wasn't shocking to many who had known Carl as a kid star. Sidney Kibrick, his former co-star, subsequently claimed that he was also the bully off-screen. It had always felt like the end was close. But there were other tragedies from that cast than Carl's. After undergoing extensive weight loss surgery, Norman Chaney, who played Chubby, passed away at a young age from heart failure. He was 21. Weezer, whose real name was Bobby Hutchins, perished in a World War II aircraft accident. He was only 20. Once dubbed the next big thing, Scotty Beckett died at the age of 38 after developing a drug addiction. Before dying of a stroke at the age of 56, Matthew Beard, known to fans as Stymie, battled drugs for years. Additionally, Darla Hood, the happy girl in so many episodes, passed away aged 47 from heart failure following a botched routine operation. Before they reached old age, almost 20 Rascals perished. A curse was attributed by some, not even Sidney Kibrick. It was choices, not fate, he remarked. He attributed his survival to self-control, accumulating money, and timing his departure from Hollywood. At 11 o'clock, he left and never returned. Kibrick went in a new direction. He attended a typical school. He avoided the craziness of Hollywood. His real estate ventures later brought in more money than his on-screen career ever did. During the Depression, his parents had required that he save every penny he made. That was the best thing they ever did, he said. He saw the others go down, and he literally maintained tabs. Every rascal he knew was listed, along with their birth, reason of death, and cause of death. He updated the file, shed a tear or two, and went on with his life each time another one came and went. It was how he grieved. He arranged one last gathering in 1981. He gave every cast member a call. He arranged lodging, haggled over airfare, and even hired Leonard Maltin to serve as the host. More than 3,000 fans attended. History seemed to come to life. The memorial reels caused some people to cry. Others performed traditional tunes. The children from the screen were reunited for 2 days. Additionally, they were viewed as more than just heartbreaking news stories for the first time in decades. Sidney Kibrick was the last to remain by 2023. He served as the last connection to those early shorts after Robert Blake and baby Jane passed away. He was said to as the only survivor by reporters. His biography was updated on Wikipedia. People began approaching him to correct historical falsehoods and fact-check documentaries. He took it seriously because it became a new kind of obligation. In his study, he hung a sheet with the names of all the Rascals, death one by one. He drew a line underneath the last box once it was filled. Only 3 words, "I remain here." He did more than simply lament them. he paid them respect. On a scorching day in 2022, he appeared to the Hollywood Museum. He arrived from the old days on a duplicate scooter. He was wearing his original leather jacket and a broad smile. Tourists let out a shout. He made a joke. He was a storyteller. For a brief instant, it seemed as though the Rascals had returned. He still walks a mile every morning at the age of 96. He keeps tabs on his real estate holdings. He refers to the woman he travels with as his lady friend. They also traveled to numerous of locations together. When he's in a hotel, he keeps a DVD player in his backpack so he can view the old shorts again. He is still a driver. He still cracks jokes. Additionally, he continues to eat oatmeal daily because, in his own words, Spanky loved it. He personally responds to each fan letter message. Some come from individuals in their 80s, others come from children. At one point, a Dublin kid questioned him if he truly detested Spanky. Kibrick chuckled and returned a cartoon depicting Butch pursuing Woeem. He spends more than $1,000 annually to ensure that even followers from other countries receive a response. Since 1981, he has stuffed 14 boxes full of mail. He refers to them as his live journal. He intends to give them to a library someday. They remain with him for the time being. Many wonder how he survived while so many others did not. He merely states that he had chance, distance, and assistance. He never elaborates. The umpire hasn't ruled me out yet, but he told one journalist, "I'm an extra inning." He aspires to outlive Hal Roach, the man who initiated it all, by 1 year. He would then be 104.